look at the relevance to the local levels, we find that there's a imbalance between the allocation of finance from the international development community as opposed to what we see at the local level when we're actually working on the ground. We find that the demand from municipalities in particular and other regional governments, national governments, but particularly the demand from the local level is extremely strong. And this is certainly not matched by a level of activity in the international development sector. There is a lot of activity for technology promoting companies, and wherever we go in our work, there's always 5 or 6, if not more, technology companies which are promoting what may or may not be a good idea, quite heavily financed by, I suspect, by equity capital. Level of financing certainly doesn't reflect doesn't help that battle to be balanced well, in my opinion. On the 0.25% issue, I think there's a lot also, perhaps, and I don't know whether Dave would be, I'm sure Dave would be the best person to clarify on this one, but there's also a lot of waste management activity in other types of program which are not necessarily called waste, in governance programs, in health related programs, and inter-service utility programs. Often waste management is seen as a very visible and practical activity and is implemented under the frame of other types of program as well. So the number might be higher than that in practice.
I mean, picking up Andy's last point, yeah, in terms of the proportion of development finance that is focused on solid waste. I mean, it's probably worth just explaining that my colleagues and I at Leeds, working with David Wilson at Imperial College as well, when we analysed the level of development finance that was focused on solid waste, we actually reviewed something like 4,000 different projects to really try and identify what proportion was focused on waste management as an issue, and recognising the fact, as Andy rightly points out, that waste management quite often links with other issues. It's quite often part of broader sanitation projects in a development context, quite often part of governance or more environmental protection projects. So it's quite difficult to pick out exactly how much finance is focused on solid waste, but we did our best with the data we had from the OECD. So I think Andy's right. It's probably a bit of an underestimate, but we're confident it's not too far off. Just thinking in terms of the level of finance that development finance that solid waste gets. I mean, clearly it's around the 0.25, 3.3% mark. Know how much it should receive, because clearly donors and recipient governments and local governments are under all sorts of pressures. They have lots of different priorities that they need to meet, whether they should prioritise health over environment, over education, etc. etc. It's a very difficult challenge, but clearly waste as an issue cuts across lots of different aspects of a community in terms of the negative impacts, their impacts on health and the local environment, but also in terms of job creation and the positive benefits of improving waste services. So I think there's a good argument there that it should receive perhaps a greater focus. Whether that means more finance or not is maybe a different question. And it's also worth highlighting that the global waste management outlook that was published last year by UNEP, working with the International Solid Waste Association, actually called for something like a 10-fold increase in development finance focused on waste, looking to increase it to something like 3% over the next 15 years. And clearly that's their position on this matter, so they're arguing for a greater focus as well.
Just to comment on that point about how much is actually being invested or being spent through various financing sources on solid waste. I think one of the things I've noted always in working in solid waste, especially when it specifically municipal solid waste, is that it's often the largest expenditure or budget item for many municipal governments. It's not unusual to see that solid waste is if you kind of break it down, it's the largest single item on municipal budgets. So, and that's not surprising given that in most places or most countries, it's usually a municipal level responsibility. But in terms of where the sort of financing and sort of development corporation funding is coming from, I do agree that it's a very small percentage of the total financing flows. I was just looking at the World Bank's own numbers. We did in recent years we've done and we've updated a portfolio review, or basically a review of the entire portfolio of solid waste investments that the World Bank has financed since the year 2000, and it sounds sizable. If you look at the 15 years, it's a cumulative investment of about $3.9 billion in solid waste. However, that's in comparison to overall commitments of the World Bank. I mean, for investment projects for both IBRD and IDA of around $35 billion a year. So 3.9 billion over 15 years is probably just about 1%. If you look at an average commitment of about 35 billion per year in total for all of the World Bank investment projects. I have to say, of course, that the annual the total annual commitments of the World Bank, of IBRD and IDA, it fluctuates from year to year. It just it depends on a number of different factors. So I think it is a small fraction, but I would say at least with most of the multilateral development banks, I think one of the key factors is the client demand, right? So it's what the governments and our development partners are asking for. We obviously, avoid, what you would describe as sort of donor-driven projects. And so I think this also reflects the relative priorities that national and sometimes subnational governments place on, just in terms of what they're using the MDB financing for. Mm-hmm. One other point I'd just like to make before I stop is also to note that one thing we noticed in the portfolio review is that most of the solid waste investments done through World Bank projects tend to be as part of projects that are investing in other things. It's not very common to see what we would describe as a pure solid waste project. So it's usually a municipal services project or an environmental infrastructure project, which then allows us to sort of also address solid waste issues and and then invest in solid waste.